Hello and welcome to our session. I'm Cara Altimus, Director at the Milken Institute Center for Strategic Philanthropy. Today, we will dive deep into a discussion about how philanthropists have and can respond to the evolving global health crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed ineffective and unequitable systems ranging from economics to healthcare. The severity of the crisis may make it a little less surprising then that in just the first half of 2020, nearly $12 billion dollars have been given from philanthropy in response to the immediate needs and services arising from the pandemic. What we're seeing in the second half is a move away from immediate response into what the sustainable response must be, rather than return to our old normal, which was broken for people and planet. We are on the cusp of a great global reset, but improvement for all will require intention and leadership. Philanthropy is unique in its ability to serve as a risk-tolerant capital source. Philanthropy is responsive, nimble, and flexible in ways that other sources of funding are not. It's also uniquely able to bring people and sectors in the same room, or if it's 2020, Zoom, to work together to rebuild in ways that are effective, equitable, and just. But in a world that feels as though it's been turned upside down, or this year, when global conference is in October rather than April, and we didn't quite start on time for this session, we noted that aside from all of those issues, the landscape of giving was suddenly more complex and changing more rapidly than normal. The needs were many, and they're diverse in sector and scale, geography, and time. Our team responded to this complex landscape by creating the Giving Smarter in the Age of COVID-19 series, which offers a roadmap for high-impact philanthropists to use their resources to respond, reset, and reboot so that we might have systems that are better than we had before. The series covers 4 key areas that our team determined needed extra attention. The first is the mental well-being of young people and those engaged in higher education. The second is around access to mental health care for all, because we've seen a dramatic decline in the ability for people to access this kind of health care. The third is around bolstering the system that supports biomedical research so that we can continue to make progress in developing treatments for the 10,000 known diseases beyond COVID-19. And the final is on investment in the environment, because environmental issues are threat multipliers. We've seen it this year, but we also know that they exacerbate inequality and degrading human health. Today, I'm joined by 4 panelists who all have deep knowledge and expertise in these exact areas. We're going to dive in to understand how and why these are important areas to be thinking about this year and beyond so that we can come out on the other side of this pandemic better together. We're excited to have them all together here to share their views on how the pandemic has affected giving. First, we have Cindy Citrone, founder and CEO of Citrone 33. She works at the intersection of mental health and education. Hello, Cindy.
Hi.
Second, we have Ellen Dorsey. She's the executive director of the Wallace Global Fund and supports people-powered movements to fight for a healthy planet. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, good day.
Next, we have Obi Felten. She's the head of Getting Moonshots Ready for Contact with the Real World at X, an Alphabet company. Obi focuses on cutting-edge technology and how they can be integrated into our lives. And finally, last but not least, we have Marilyn Simons. She's president of the Simons Foundation and longtime biomedical researcher. So I want to make the most of the time that we have today, so we're going to dive right in. Our collective mental health has taken a nosedive during the pandemic. We're seeing increased rates of depression in all ages. Most people have experienced loneliness at levels they have never experienced before due to the necessary social isolation. but dramatic increases in unemployment, fear, and grief are also key drivers of depression. Cindy and Obi, you both have dedicated your time and efforts to the mental health space, but in different ways. Cindy, your unique lens in student well-being from being a parent has led you to work in mental health at universities in the Pittsburgh area. Can you tell us what drove you to be motivated in this area and share some of your work and how it has been impacted by and is helping people in times of COVID?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. In 2018, when we first really started to dive deeper into this issue, we saw an emerging epidemic in young adults. 20% had reported clinical anxiety that was so great it affected them to treatment. 68% were so stressed or nervous that it limited their quality of daily life. That was in 2018. That same study in 2020 has found that the numbers have jumped to 60% experiencing clinical anxiety and 86% experiencing stress and anxiety that is limiting their quality of life. We are in the next pandemic. And quite frankly, what we have set up now is not ready in our college and university system to address those needs. So when COVID hit, we immediately took the community that we had started to form to address this issue and said, what can we do in response to this unprecedented challenges? And we spoke to 9 universities in the city of Pittsburgh and their presidents. And they identified that they would be so busy. It was such a challenge to even get their students back on campus safely that it was really not going to have the opportunity to create services or additional support for students as they return to campus. We find that colleges and universities are assessed invested partners because they're uniquely positioned to help students develop long life stress management skills, resiliency, and emotion regulation skills. We like to say they have kids in the game. So Unpack You was born. Unpack You was born in the spring of 2020 to address these needs in our Pittsburgh town. Uniting over 100,000 students, we immediately went into action to identify ways to make students feel mentally and physically safe back on campus, how to identify warning signs. We partnered with JED Campus for their expertise. We looked for new ways to help students connect in this virtual world, to bridge them from the services that were already in existence and get them to use those services, to find an entry point. And we look at finishing off this semester with a celebration of their resilience, to say to the students, you survived and it was okay just to be okay. If you are even at this point, the most difficult semester ever in the history of universities and colleges. What we really want to do this is through the youth lens. Meet them where they were on their media forums, their things. We did things such as virtual trivia nights that the prize was a mental resource guide. We sent up webinars and connections where they could meet with each other to discuss their interests. And we look at having online celebrations as well as in-person celebrations. We'd look to continue this work with virtual internships in the spring, with more work into connecting administrations and colleges to share these ideas and to provide turnkey solutions at low cost, high impact for campuses. Kind of like to say that we'd like one less calculus skill and one more coping skill.
Super cool. And really hitting on a really critical time window in a person's life. And when we know that we see such a high increase in mental health issues. So Obi, Cindy's initiative speaks to the fact that we have holes in the need space, and that particularly falls and hits mental health hard. You're working on applying technological solutions to another critical gap, access to quality mental health care. In our mental health report, we reference US access data and usage statistics from online crisis support centers and estimated that potentially up to 75% of people experiencing mental health issues this year are unable to access quality care. Can you share how your team at X, or you and your team at X, are working to bring cutting edge technologies to improve this problem, and how philanthropists might engage?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with you that there's a huge access problem in mental health, and that's actually quite multifaceted. So there are not enough mental health professionals. They're unevenly distributed. So many of them are on the coast, and the middle of the country has almost none. And if you look globally, the global south has far fewer mental health professionals than richer countries. And then also mental health care isn't as covered by insurance. So it makes it unaffordable. And then finally, there's a huge stigma still that prevents people from seeking help. So I think technology can be applied in multiple areas. So the first one is COVID made incredibly obvious, which is telehealth. It jumped up across all the sectors when COVID hit, and then kind of declined again over the summer. But for therapy and psychiatry, it actually remains at about 70%. You mentioned crisis support. That's another one, right? Like text support has been like well established. So I think those are examples where tech is already embedded in the system. But the new emerging ones where I think philanthropy can help is one, digital therapeutics. So you can think of these as a form of digital medication or therapy. And there's a lot of startups working in this space. There's a lot of academic groups developing new therapeutics, but they're still in the kind of earlier stages of being validated. So, for example, I'm on the board of a social venture called BFB Labs in London, and they're making video games for anxiety for young people. Or there is initiatives to use VR to address anxiety. And then the third area that I'm personally most passionate about is measurement. So part of the issue with mental health is that it's very difficult to measure. So it's one of the few conditions where we just rely on asking people how they are. And we ask them to kind of average over the last 2 weeks. That's like when you fill in a PHQ-9 survey or when your doctor asks you those questions about your symptoms, it's very difficult to say like how on average you slept over the last 2 weeks or how your mood has been, because it changes all the time. So that's where technology can come in to give us a more precise measurement. And my team at X, we've been working on actually using brainwaves to see how depressed or anxious someone is. That's still confidential. We're hoping to make an announcement in the first week of November, so stay tuned for that. But we can also use wearables like Fitbit or this Aura ring that I'm wearing, which measures heart rate variability and sleep patterns, which are really important indicators of what someone's mental health state is. And where this ties in with Cindy's work, I think, is that students are one of the groups that we identified as being incredibly open to this. They live on their smartphones anyway, so they're much more open to these kind of new ways of measurement. And they also said it's very empowering for them. So as opposed to giving all of the power to the therapist or the doctor, they come in with their own data and they say, I'm understanding myself better, and that's how I'm able to take some action. And it might involve self-care, like, for instance, Headspace, which is a meditation app. Headspace is actually running 70 validation studies at the moment to demonstrate how meditation can have an impact on mental health, and specifically that you can use an app to help you do it. So lots and lots of potential.
Incredible. I have to say that I think we've all experienced the absence of time in the pandemic. And so when it might have been hard and normal, maybe 2019, to say how I felt over the last 2 weeks, I barely can remember this morning. So I can only imagine that that's more relevant.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, one of the great things about the pandemic, though, is, I mentioned telehealth. The other one I would say is the fact that the anxiety has been so universal. Everyone has experienced some of it over the last 6 months. So I'm hoping that it will actually destigmatize mental health to some degree, because so many more people were experiencing these kind of symptoms. When you look at the data, in adults, it went from about 11% pre-pandemic to about 33% in the summer. And when you look at young people, it went from like 33% to almost 50%. So the numbers are just, it's a mass issue. It's no longer just a niche.
I'm hoping that that's a silver lining that comes out of this moment, but hard one. Marilyn, I have a similar question for you, but refocusing on biomedical research. Your background is on research, as is mine, and it has been hard to see how much our research communities are suffering, and in ways that we never imagined. The National Institute of Health projects over $10 billion in just 2020 of research losses associated with the pandemic. That's more than a quarter of their annual budget. We've also seen billions in funding redirected towards COVID research, which is necessary, but then means that we have less money in other areas of research. Clinical trials for non-COVID therapies are stalled. Labs have shuttered for months. Given these losses, can you give insight into how funders can respond and how funders should be working with their grantees and biomedical researchers to continue moving work forward?
So, sure. I'd love to talk about this. I want to just make one point of clarification, and that is that my own background is in economics. And rather than biomedical research itself. And one reason why I love focusing on science is that I think science really has the power to be transformational in our economy and give us new products and new approaches to old problems, and can really has a potential to improve our lives. I love scientific research and learning about it. And I can see that the scientific community has responded. Cara, you talked about funds being diverted to COVID research, but some of those funds have been scientists taking their expertise in another area and applying it to COVID. So using experts in cryo-EM are looking at the coronavirus and analyzing it. People who look at proteins are, using their skills to communicate more and help people understand the coronavirus. Genomics, even cancer research, are using some of their insights and helping move the science along. And what's been really amazing about this is how collaborative the scientific community has been. They've been interdisciplinary. They have meetings that have global access, and it's so much more less expensive for people to participate because they can attend virtually. So we're really seeing the flow of the information accelerate. And this also has impacted the way information is disseminated through journals, because so many research pieces are being uploaded onto software platforms and preprint servers. So information is flowing. So what can you do to support your scientists? People are looking at less restrictive grant making, supporting institutions and giving more help to indirect costs, adding flexibility to the deliverables on foundation or philanthropic grants. There's a lot we can do to help support the process, and scientists are eager to participate and continue to advance our knowledge.
I think it's even more exciting and amazing that you're making these connections between economics and science. And I certainly will say we've seen within our programs scientists really innovating in new ways around process and application of their tools across the work. And just to double click on the idea of more flexibility as we move forward into the future, we see that as extremely necessary as well. Alan, I want to shift gears just a little bit. At the beginning of the pandemic, we heard a lot of speculation about the biological origin of COVID. Was it a bat, a pangolin? And in all of that back and forth, it felt pretty easy to miss that this pandemic is not actually the first zoonotic disease that we've experienced in the last decade. It really highlights that the health and environmental sectors tend to work in separate spheres, and that we know that environmental issues are threat multipliers. How can philanthropy bring these ideas together in a cross-sectoral manner to encourage collaboration and avoid future environment health interactions like a pandemic?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's a significant honor to be here with these wonderful women leaders in philanthropy. And I will go in a little bit different direction just to say that, yes, the environment is a threat to society. But I really want to reinforce what was said at the beginning of the panel around the nexus that we're sitting at of these intersecting and compounding crises. COVID, the historic economic dislocation, on top of a spiraling climate emergency. And if the world's crises are intersecting, so too must be our response. We can no longer fund or respond in historic silos. And I think we have a moral responsibility to put those most impacted of these intersecting crises at the center of our response. And to do that means we have to give smarter, one of the themes of this panel, but I'm also going to say we have to give more. And we need to also deploy our investments as a tool to aid in responding. Topics I'd like to respond to. But as to the environmental and COVID nexus, look, we have changed our physical environment dramatically. We have placed massive demands on nature and natural systems, and the blowback is enormous. Perhaps one silver lining, if there are any, of COVID is that it makes our physical reality and fragility tangible. COVID exposes this in dramatic ways. It also shows we have to follow the science, which my colleagues have been speaking about, as well as the science of climate change. We have to change the energy base of our economy to reverse the climate change trajectory and protect human health. Air pollution is driven by the burning of fossil fuels, and at the same time has exposed people that are exposed to air pollution are also more vulnerable to COVID impacts. We have already seen studies coming out that are finding an increased rate of COVID in areas of high pollution exposure. A study out of Harvard found that someone living in an area of high particulate pollution is actually 8% more likely to die from COVID than others living in an area with just one small unit less pollution. And these studies and others are concluding that a small increase in long-term exposure to pollution causes larger increases in the COVID death rate. That's a very specific example of the nexus between the pollution driving sources that have led to climate change and their impact on human health. We know that there is an enormous public health benefit to getting off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We also know that infectious diseases will spread with climate, with more insect-borne diseases such as Lyme's and dengue exploding. We know that the root causes of climate change will increase the risk of pandemics, and the list goes on and on as to why. Deforestation, the habitat loss, habitat migration, changing patterns of contact between animals and people, etc. However, the solutions are actually fairly simple. We need to move off of fossil fuels. We need to fund and resource getting access to safe, clean, and affordable electricity for those that don't currently have it, so that they can actually have health clinics with electricity that can store vaccines, etc. Additionally, we know that water is a critical piece of the response to public health crises. Individuals need access to safe, clean water. It's a fundamental human right. It is literally critical in COVID, when those that are of lowest wealth typically are the ones that have to go out and work and are more vulnerable to COVID. Access to water is crucial. So this crisis exposes for us that we must work at the nexus of public health and environmental issues, as well as economic and social justice. And so philanthropy, I believe, has to begin to work more at the intersection of crises, has to work through the lens of building power to change systems. Our systems create a lot of profit for industry, the fossil fuel industry, the big pharma, the agricultural sector. And to change these systems will require building the power of people who can advocate for the kind of social and environmental change that has to happen. And philanthropy doesn't put a lot of resources into that kind of advocacy work or movement building work. But if we're really looking long term about what comes out of this historic moment, it has to be through the lens of intersectionality. It has to be through the lens of supporting communities and social movements and building power. And I think that means we also have to talk about giving more and doing more from our very, very privileged position in philanthropy.
Incredible. So I want to just highlight, you shared this number around 8% increased death for people living in communities with high air pollution. And I can, based on all the other data that we're seeing, I imagine that that represents the tip of the iceberg. And we have other data that shows that living in communities with higher pollution also impacts mental health, bringing all of this full circle to show just how much intersectionality there is. Thinking about environment in a slightly different lens, and that if we look at our communities and their influence on health and well-being, our community is essentially another way of thinking about environment. Cindy, while I've heard rumor that you bleed black and gold, I actually know that you usually have a terrible towel on hand to cheer on the Steelers. You have been thinking about how to rally community in very ingenious ways so that we might improve health and well-being one NFL stadium at a time, which might sound small. I looked it up. It's 70,000 people in 4 hours. How are you leveraging these ideas, and how you built a movement in prior years to address COVID-19 in 2020?
So, well, absolutely, terrible towel in hand as promised and always there. Using sort of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy's ways to utilize all of your talents, all of your ties. It was about 5 years ago that we decided in the city of Pittsburgh to start a place-based effort around mental well-being, integrating the whole town. The World Health Organization recommends mental illness be addressed from a public health perspective, rather focusing solely on individuals. In this model, members are introduced to health promotion and positive strategy. And we thought, what better than a way of Pittsburgh, the community that is such a wonderful home for my husband and I and our family, to try an experiment of this model. Could we integrate the community to create positive climate and shared experiences to promote health prevention strategies among those who may not even think that they need it? Basically, could we create a city of well-being? And can we use uniting the 9 universities? Could we continue to layer and model on that? And remarkably, it went, Pittsburgh's a special place. We asked, it's this place that is small enough to get things done, big enough to get noticed. And we went to the Steelers and we said, would you help us promote these strategies? And they said, of course. And then we thought even bigger. We went to the hockey team, the Penguins. Would you help us promote these strategies? And they said, yes. And then we went to the Pirates. And then we went to the businesses. And we're continuing on this place-based effort to unite an entire town to focus on strategies that could be integrated into the daily life to help you reduce stress, regulate emotion, be more mindful to your environment, and to improve your interpersonal effectiveness skills. The basis was that if we were all working on the same goal to increase this culture, to increase our quality of life, that we could support each other. And the premise also is that it didn't have to be rocket science. It didn't have to be research-based, course longs. Everyone didn't need to actually see a therapist, even though that is my goal still. That these skills could be delivered on scalable, digestible ways. For example, one activity that we're launching this fall with the Steelers is called the Little Black and Gold Book of Gratitude. And we asked 33 of the Steelers' greatest players of the organization, from Mean Joe Green, who we now call Grateful Joe Green, to Ben Roethlisberger, to our receiver Juju, to share with us a quote that they show gratitude. What are they grateful for every day? We compiled the 33 of these, which is the 33 Foundation, also 1933, the year the Steelers were founded, and put them in a little pocket-sized book that we will be distributing through the city of Pittsburgh with anyone who makes a donation to our local food community bank. This book not only has these quotes, it's an active journal to engage citizens to reflect on their favorite athletes' quotes and to add their quote. This journal then will serve as a tool on days that they feel they may need a boost. What are they grateful for? It will be surrounded by an entire city-wide media campaign, both digital, billboards and such. We want the entire town to be talking about what they are grateful for, about being thankful as we enter into the holidays and as we wrap up 2020. And if we can do it this year, that says a lot.
Yes, I was appreciating and commenting that in our lead-up reel, there was the empathy and gratitude fact that just showed astronomical gratitude and empathy this year across the population, which I was saying.
Yeah, kindness, gratitude, skills that we all have that we just have to, the pandemic, there was another silver lining of that. We're really starting to focus on what's important and valued.
Yeah, I agree. Similarly, while preparing for this conversation, I heard from Marilyn and Ellen that the idea around environments expands, and environments being a threat multiplier, expands beyond the environment. And actually, we can think about the same concept through systemic inequality, and that this is compounding health problems. We've seen reports that women and minority scientists are publishing at a lower rate within science. Women and, yes, I did say scientists. And that suggests that they're less able to participate in research this year. Similarly, we've seen clinical trial recruitment highlighted this year. And in that, it's become more clear to the public that the system, clinical trial system, has an overrepresentation of individuals of European descent. And then finally, I think we just saw last week in California, a difference in rates of access to COVID tests based on communities that people are living in. All of these really show that it's hard to target philanthropic dollars to the communities that need them most, but it's ever so more important that we do it. I want to ask both of you, how we think about doing that effectively and more as we move into the future. Marilyn, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, one thing I think is that we also have to have science representative of diversity. I think that we have to have leadership out there that is a voice for all people and that is welcoming and brings everyone in. We're focusing ourselves, we do a lot of science communication and we do want to build public trust in science. And we want to make the insights of science more available to everybody. We have outreach programs. We also support a lot of science and math education across New York City, and we have worked with the state to have programs with the state, and we hope to actually go national with our STEM programs. I think that helping people to understand science, what's the nature of proof, and make everybody feel that the information is accessible to them, that they can participate in research safely, and that surveys reflect their outlooks. I think this is all important ways that we can create access and really have science reflect the ideas of the democracy that we live in. So I'm kind of focusing more on making science more approachable and accessible to all so that we all feel a part. That's one side of it, the supply side. And I think you're speaking also to how could we help fund the needs that are there and support the demand side of science. And I think that we have to be creative, that we have to work and build our public health system to help us come up with a leadership that will take us into the next decade of how we can be more effective with our public health administration. Ellen, do you have ideas on this too?
Marilyn, I love this idea of supply and demand side. I had not conceived of it that way before, and I'm going to start reframing. I think that's brilliant. Ellen, do you have a perspective on this from your work?
Yeah, I'm going to say a couple of things, maybe a little go in a particular direction. Look, we know we can't change the systems driving the problems that we're discussing, the enormous and historic problems we're discussing, without looking through the lens of racial, gender, and economic justice. And we need to support the communities and movements that are demanding racial, gender, and economic justice. And the good news is that we're living through a moment of absolute historic organizing, connecting, and mobilizing across communities to demand that those that are most impacted by COVID, by economic injustice, by climate change, are at the center of the solutions. And philanthropy, I believe, has to respond to the moment we're in. We cannot conduct business as usual. We have to resource these movements to be successful, to be able to achieve the kind of change that is required of this moment. And so that means we have to give differently. Give smarter is the theme of this panel. We have to give differently, and we have to give more. When COVID hit, our foundation knew its impacts would be massive and would precipitate a significant economic crisis, and as well could disrupt progress on climate change, diverting needed funds and attention. We knew that if history was a guide, during past economic downturns, philanthropy retrenched in giving rather than truly stepping up to the plate. We made an immediate pledge to pay out 20% of our endowment, and we called on other foundations to give and give again. And many have stepped up their funding. But we cannot stick to a strict 5% payout at this moment. I want you to think about this. If we really believe we are facing historic crises and also historic rising of people demanding change, what are we squirreling our acorns away? Or do we think there's going to be another colder winter somewhere down the line? Imagine if we just paid out 10% over the next 3 years as an emergency charity stimulus. That alone would bring $200 billion more into the nonprofit sector, many of whom have lost their jobs in the nonprofit sector. We need to be thinking profoundly differently about this moment. As well, we need to be thinking about how we invest our endowments. We cannot pretend that our investments sit over there and we make grants with just a fraction of that money over there. Sometimes actually asking our grantees to clean up the problems that we're driving with our investments. Fossil fuels and climate change, big pharma and the health system, ag. I mean, just go on and on. And yet, we are leaving money on the table that could go into community development funds, that could go into minority-owned local businesses putting people back to work. I mean, we could be investing in indigenous communities building their own solar and wind resources and generating revenue for them. I just think this is a moment that is so historic. Philanthropy needs to respond accordingly. And if we stay in our silos and we think about paying out the same amount we've always paid out because whatever, perpetuity, you could still exist in perpetuity and pay out more. You're making way more than 5%. It's time to step up to the plate and really live up to the privilege that has been invested in us and the responsibility to serve the public good.
Ellen, amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I want to, while we're talking about the need for more, one of the things that we entered with is that philanthropy is able to in a more risk-tolerant manner, and that is very important for innovation. And we could take this two ways and talk about economics, but I want to actually let Obi share for a second about why that risk tolerance is so necessary with your innovation hat on, and in particular, where you've seen changes happening in 2020, and how do we carry those forward so that we create greater incentive and greater good as we move past 2020.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, the echo's gone, thank God. Yes, Cara, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think what I've seen in the sort of short term addressing the COVID crisis with philanthropy has been really interesting that some of the foundations that normally would take a long time to make up their mind whether they're going to fund something have just moved faster, deploying like a smaller sum maybe initially to fund a pilot. So, and that was specifically around projects that are impacting the pandemic. So I worked personally on one called Heroes Health, which was an initiative started by a doctor at UNC called Sam McLean. And it's for first responders and healthcare workers to help them measure their own mental health and mental well-being, which is massively hit. Right? You can imagine just how grim it is to have been working in the ICU in New York in February and March. And so they're piloting it with several hospitals such as UNC and Cooper and Brigham and Women's. And Philanthropy actually stepped in to fund that pilot because Sam normally gets his funding from, the NIH and so on, but all those cycles are just too slow. And several foundations said, okay, we'll give you money to fund the pilot. And then if the pilot works and we want to roll out, we'll give you more. So I think that's a way the tech industry works, right? Like you get a small amount of funding and then you expand as you hit certain milestones. And I think that's a great model for philanthropy as well. And then long term, I think the biggest risk investment that's really necessary is actually in mental health research, which is massively underfunded compared to, say, cancer research. And I'm on the board of two organizations now to address this. One's the Wellcome Trust, who are a large foundation, second biggest after Gates. And they pick mental health alongside infectious disease and climate change as their three strategic investment areas for the future. And then there's also a new initiative called the Healthy Brains Global Initiative that wants to raise $10 billion for mental health research. And these are kind of longer term, riskier bets, but they're really necessary. And we already mentioned some of this work has to be more intersectional and has to be more multidisciplinary. So like work that brings together academia and industry, clinicians and data scientists and neuroscientists and social workers, technologists, and people with lived experience. So for instance, I would love to see a philanthropy fund a fellows program that actually fund pairs of people or small teams rather than individuals. So I think that's really interesting. And then finally, completely agree with Helen that we shouldn't just look at the philanthropy part, we should also look at the investment part. And a friend of mine, Stephen DeBerry, he runs an investment firm that benefits East Side communities. So, Black people who live on the wrong side of the tracks, basically. And he is really very, very much looking at it, not just from a philanthropy point of view, but like he says, we need to get 1 trillion assets under management that benefit these communities. And I think that's just such an inspired, big idea is, yes, let's do this with the money that we're investing, not just the money that we're giving away.
Awesome. So as we are almost to time, I want to end honoring and celebrating the virtual environment and world that we're living in, because thank goodness we have this in this pandemic. All of you have alluded to the fact that the short-term panic funding, more than $12 billion in just the first half of 2020, needs to be stretched into the long term. We need to give more. We need to focus on intersectionality. We need to be acutely aware of communities that are impacted most. Here at Milken, we pride ourselves in advising some of the world's greatest philanthropists. In the spirit of this digital event, can you each give us a tweet version, so that's 280 characters or less, of what your call to philanthropist would be? Who wants to start?
I'll go first, because you've almost just said what I would tweet.
Okay.
Give with a justice lens. Give till it hurts. Align your investment. Hashtag emergency, charity, stimulus. Hashtag fun movements.
Amazing. Marilyn, do you want to go?
Keep scientific information flowing. Support preprint servers like hashtag bioarchive, hashtag medarchive.
Hashtag incredible. Oh.
I would say focus on the next generation, because we're not going to solve the big problems that we are creating in this world. They have to. And if they're anxious and depressed, they're not going to do it. So I guess my hashtag is youth mental health.
Real things. Cindy, do you like to give your last one?
Look for the opportunity in disruption. Unpack you. What are you leaving? What are you bringing to 2021? Hashtag kindness, hashtag gratitude, hashtag together.
Hashtag Global Conference 2021. Everyone on this call and beyond, we are so grateful to have you with us today. We are so grateful for all of the work that everyone is doing to make the world a better place, to bring philanthropy into real life, and to help the communities that need it most. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and I hope that everyone has learned a little bit more and is thinking a little bit deeper about where we can go next. So, a round of applause for our panelists. I've been clapping silently at home as I've been watching our global sessions. Thank you all, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.